There was a thin line between justice and guilt. A human skull wrapped in a black trash bag and a stray dog towing it on a stretch of road in Atlanta is how a disappearance case of 1998 has spiraled out of control and became a cold case murder trial. However, the greatest surprise was not to be found in the evidence discovered, but in the evidence lost. The prosecution had appeared to have an airtight case when they had entered the courtroom. However, as the trial continued, the disappearance of files, unrecorded videos, and hidden reports started to unravel their story. And what is the fate of the evidence which is supposed to lead to conviction when it turns into the acquittal? It is the sensational account of how an apparently strong homicide case fell, and why.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to allow the parties, the state specifically, to make its closing argument.
Thank you. So what's being depicted now is one of the first exhibits that we introduced. That is a photograph of Melissa John Wolfenbarger. And that's a photograph that was taken somewhere around 1997, a year before Melissa went missing. In 1998. We know that in 1998 she was 21 years of age. So she's roughly about 20 years old at that point.
The Vanished Woman. Melissa Wolfenbarger is a 21-year-old woman who disappeared without a trace in the quiet suburbs of Georgia late in 1998. No report of a missing person, no search of the community, no news. Christopher Wolfenbarger, her husband, informed everybody that she just one day walked out of the house and she abandoned her house, her possessions, and her life. However, after weeks had passed and months rolled, it started to sink in her that it was much more sinister. Then, in spring and summer of 1999, terror became a reality. Dismembered human remains were found in 2 plastic garbage bags, which were found in the vicinity of the place where Christopher works. The identification of the victim was almost impossible, but it was shocking in the region. 5 years on, in 2003, forensic testing confirmed what Melissa's family was in dread of. The remains were theirs.
I see a smile, but I also see hope. I see hope when I look at that photograph because of what she must have thought about her children, what she hoped for them, the life that she hoped to live. And I think about the 27 years that has passed and how long that is to wait for justice. So that 27 years, that's a long time to experience life. That's a long time to fall down and get up. And fall down and get up. That's time to experience and have memories with your children. Children that don't have a memory of Melissa. Not Joseph, not Christina. That's an opportunity to have and create memories with your grandchildren. That's 3 grandchildren that you heard Christina testify. She's got 3 boys.
What now ensued was bewilderment, gossip, and suspicion. The sudden disappearance of Melissa, the horrible find, and the strangely unemotional reactions of Christopher all gave a chilling scene. But even the chilling sound of it could do nothing to put the investigation on the right track for years. The case became cold. The pieces of evidence were scattered over the time in storage rooms.
Are you just speculating about that?
There was a video, the VHS recording.
Can you stick with the microphone?
There was a VHS recording at one time that showed the dog dragging the bag out of the woods. Now, I don't know where it's
Dragging
at
the
now.
bag with the skull out of the woods?
Yes.
There was no detectives out there until after the skull was already there.
VHS recording. That's a security camera. It's so old.
Where is the evidence of that?
I'm sorry.
Has anybody ever had evidence of that? Is that in any police report anywhere?
I don't know.
Are you just kind of making it up today?
No.
I've read every report you've ever written, every report every other detective has written.
There are reports missing. I don't know why, but there are some reports missing.
Have you told the DAs there are reports missing?
Yeah. But I mean,
which DA did you tell that there are reports missing?
Gentleman here just questioned me that I had more reports in this file and they're not.
And where's the VHS?
I don't know.
Did you tell them there was a VHS recording that's missing? You told?
Yes.
Mr. Wilson that? When did you tell him that?
The other day when he called me.
However, what made this story even more dark was the person Melissa was affiliated to. She was not just any other lost woman, but the daughter of a convicted serial killer. Such a relationship would shortly snarl this inquiry into something much more complicated. It was not only the story of a missing wife, but also the history of violence, of silence and truths, and a justice system that found it more difficult to assemble a body, a motive, and a mystery that had taken decades to create.
And I think about the 27 years that has passed and how long that is to wait for justice. That 27 years is a long time to experience life. That's a long time to fall down and get up. And fall down and get up. That's time to experience and have memories with your children. Children that don't have a memory of Melissa. Not Joseph, not Christina. That's an opportunity to have and create memories with your grandchildren. I have 3 grandchildren that you heard Christina testify. She's got 3 boys.
The specter of the Flint River Killer. The disappearance of Melissa Wolfenbarger was never a mere tragedy on its own, but her blood was haunted. Her dad, Carl Patton, a notorious murderer of the so-called Flint River Killer, was a known murderer whose stressful acts left many victims in the 1970s. The name was a power, fear, infamy, and stigma that was attached to the Wolfenbarger family even now. The disappearance of Melissa made that shadow cast over all the investigative notes, all the interviews, and all the theories. Was it due to the violent nature of her father that brought Melissa to her destiny, or was she just another victim in a totally different plot?
This case is about domestic violence. This case is about intimidation. This case is about loss of control. The loss of control that this defendant had over the custody of his children and over Melissa. No matter how much they want this case to be about Carl Patton, this case has nothing to do with Carl Patton, other than the fact that he asked law enforcement to find his daughter.
This history would be later used against the defense. They claimed that the state possessed tunnel vision, that they were too keen to lay the blame of Christopher at Christopher, as he was the husband, the most convenient target. They implied that the investigators were overlooking other options: revenge associated with the history of Carl Patton, the people he offended, or an attempt to make the daughter of a serial killer remain quiet. It was a frightening suggestion, and it struck a chord. Even the prosecution were aware that this was not a cut-and-dry case. Word went round courtrooms, and the press was talking afterward that maybe the name Wolfenbarger itself was the curse of the case.
The defense in this case is Carl Patton. Listen to the theory, the opening statement. The defense in this case is Carl Patton killed Melissa Wolfenbarger. Other than the fact that evidence came in that Carl Patton committed murders, what other piece of evidence or fact, anything that you heard during the course of this week, what points to that? What other fact would allow you to create that inference? Other than the fact that he killed someone, evidence came in that Melissa didn't even know about it. The only thing that's come in about the relationship between the Pattons and their children is that they appear to love each other.
The reality of the matter was that dark family history made everything complicated. It was a thin line between right and wrong, perception and reality, and it left jurors asking themselves whether justice was indeed being served or was the state in a process of revising a convenient history. It may have been the Flint River Killer behind bars, but his shadow was still in the room. Beyond the signal of each move, he was molding each suspicion and threatening to reverse the state case before it started.
This case is about domestic violence. This case is about intimidation. This case is about loss of control. The loss of control that this defendant had over the custody of his children and over Melissa. No matter how much they want this case to be about Carl Patton, this case has nothing to do with Carl Patton, other than the fact that he asked law enforcement to find his daughter.
The charges and the grand jury. More than 40 years of silence ended with a shocking development on August 27, 2024. The Fulton County grand jury charged Christopher Wolfenbarger with murder and felony murder in the death of Melissa. It has been over 25 years since she vanished. A case which was believed to have been buried long ago was brought back. the prosecutors entered the courtroom without any doubt of having got the right man. This was a vindication to investigators who had waited half their career to get this chance. It was referred to by headlines as justice delayed, not denied. But there was already a cracking on the other side of that success.
In the Superior Court of Fulton County, State of Georgia, the State of Georgia versus Christopher Wolfenbarger, case number 24 SC 004201. Count 1, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. This 22nd day of August 2025.
Everything had been worn away by time, memories, evidence, the credibility of witnesses. The remains had been held in store years. Forensic technology had evolved and important records were incomplete. The case the prosecution presented was based on pieces, circumstantial evidence, inconsistency of statements, and an analysis of the behavioral patterns decades ago. They told me that it was a solid story, but in fact, the narrative had a lot of holes. The defense took advantage of each one of them, subverting the trustworthiness of a case constructed on dust and rottenness. And even though the ruling of the grand jury to indict appeared like a step to justice, it also brought a chilling question. Was it justice or closure? In some cases, decades of disappointment have caused prosecutors to proceed with what they can rather than what they should be able to, which is sometimes filled in by human emotion. When the trial date of 2025 moved closer, one thing became apparent, and that is that this was not going to be a straightforward prosecution. It was a time trial itself, and the weight of evidence was greater than at any previous time. The chief investigator talks and walks. When the state called Detective Dale Kelly to the stand, the courtroom was anticipating fireworks. Kelly was not a rookie, but the homicide detective of Atlanta who had arrived at the scene back in 1999 when the severed head of Melissa was found in the woods. He sketched us a clear picture. A lost dog, he said, had pulled out a plastic bag through the woods and onto an adjacent lot, and investigators made a horrifying find. He went so far as to say a videotape was made of the initial stages of the investigation. A videotape that, had it been authentic, would have solidified major facts regarding the manner and the location of the discoveries. But when the cross-examination commenced, everyone was upset. The defense counsel put him to the test. Where is the tape? Who logged it? Kelly hesitated.
There was no detectives out there until after the skull was already there.
VHS recording. That's a security camera. It's so old.
Where is the evidence of that?
No such video was recorded on record or had a chain of custody or any evidence tag. The case file did not have even a portion of his initial reports. What had started as a self-assertive testament became clumsy and hasty. Kelly, who had been the anchor to the prosecution, was their liability now. I think the dog dragged it out of the woods, he said again, but that was not what a jury wanted to know. The case court environment changed. What was constructed as a solid eyewitness account fell apart due to bad documentation. There was just one witness to testify, one lost tape record, and all of a sudden the basis of the case made by the state seemed shaky. It was not merely the credibility of the lead investigator that failed her, it was her credibility that burst on record. The ambush claim and discovery failures. When the prosecution was already credibility challenged, this became shattered after the defense uncovered significant violations of discoveries. The law of Georgia requires the prosecutors to exchange all the witness statements, reports, and evidence that may help the defense, particularly prior to trial. However, as the investigation went on, the defense found a disturbing trend that included missing reports, withheld witness statements, and that elusive VHS tape that was never actually given away. The defense lawyer named it as such, an ambush. They charged the state in an open court with springing surprises during the trial process without giving them a chance to prepare or verify any important information. It is a tense moment. The jurors were observing how the defense team was tearing the organization and professionalism of the prosecution. The judge stepped in and was angrily annoyed at how carelessly evidence was handled. He made a rare decision and gave a curative order, asking jurors to completely ignore the testimony of Detective Kelly regarding the video. Such a directive alone undermined one of the major plots of the prosecution. Since that time, the trial has changed. What started as a self-confident, near-film noir reopening of a cold case now appeared to be a procedural nightmare. The prosecutors seemed caught by surprise, as the missing materials which were supposed to be preserved decades ago were being scrambled to explain the case. Instead, the defense side of the case took the courtroom narrative and has not only made Christopher Wolfenbarger appear like not a monster, but a man caught in a failed system. What had been touted as justice to Melissa started to appear like a lesson on how not to prosecute a cold case. The forensics don't deliver. Forensics is always noisier than any witness in a murder trial, but when it comes to this, the mute art of forensics did talk in whispers then ceased. The testament of the medical examiner was seriously harmful to the tide of prosecution. They were not able to tell how Melissa died and the exact cause because she was severely decomposed and dismembered. No bruises, no stab wounds, not even gunshot evidence, just some remains. The narrative of how and who was undone without that important forensic connection. Even the DNA evidence could not provide the knockdown blow. Although genetic testing showed Melissa, it did not find any different DNA linking Christopher to the remains, the bags, and the dump site. After decades, the forensic team confessed that due to degradation of biological traces, they could not recover these biological traces. And then there was one more strike: no murder weapon could be discovered. The plastic bags were an indication of concealment rather than identity. Circumstantial theories of behavioral red flags, strain in the relationship, motive. The prosecution attempted to lean on them all, but the defense sliced them through with just one sentence: that is speculation, not evidence. The alleged pillars of forensic broke, one at a time. Whenever the state attempted to join one of the dots, there was nothing to join it. What now was left was a story which was more conjecture than fact. Science did not point to Christopher. It pointed to doubt in the sterile light of the courtroom. And suspicion in a murder case is enough to ruin all. Strategy of the defense: the alternative suspects, doubt. The defender team was ready to do only one thing: to sow the seeds of doubt in the minds of the jurors. They did not have to establish the innocence of Christopher. They just had to cast doubt on the certainty of the state to the jurors. Their strategy was surgical. They reminded the jury that the marriage was not good, as there were recorded instances of domestic violence and bruises seen on Melissa, but it did not amount to murder. Anger doesn't equal homicide. Thereafter, they changed the target to other persons who could have had a motive. Melissa even has her own father, Carl Patton, the convicted serial killer referred to as the Flint River Killer, which had a history of gruesome crimes. The defense also indicated the inconsistencies of her mother, as it is, even in the family secrets, were a deep secret. They were asking questions regarding the time of the state, how it took a 5-year period before the remains of Melissa were even recognized, and more than 20 years before any indictment was filed. Above all, they struck the forensic gap right between the eyes. Hair and pubic hair located on the evidence did not correspond to Christopher at all. That was the physical evidence of his guilt, just did not exist. The defense pointed to the missing reports, to the missing VHS tape that nobody could locate, and to the inexplicable missing links in the process of the police. Each one of them took away the certainty of the prosecution until they were left with a shadow of a case. The message was plain and very strong, and when facts are lost, witnesses discredit, records fade, so must the confidence of the state. And doubt is the greatest weapon of defense of all in that mist of doubt. The closing of the prosecution. Overreach? As the prosecution stood to give its final argument, the courtroom was very tense. The state prosecutor did not present the case in the evidence. They presented the case in the emotion. They painted a ghost-like picture of Melissa, an abused wife, a young mother whose life was stolen. It was serious, convincing, and near dramatic. They urged the jury to look beyond the legal loopholes to see the human tragedy. In their love, though, they went too far. The conclusion section was overly based on the assumption and not on demonstration. No DNA evidence of the connection of Christopher to the crime. No murder weapon. No confirmed footage of the crime scene were present. The alleged VHS tape that might have contained the key evidence was not explained. Defense lawyers have taken advantage of that in the rebuttal and told the jury that this is not a theater of emotion, but a place of evidence. "Do you feel right about the story?" they said. "Or does it beyond a reasonable doubt prove guilt?" The gap which engulfed the case of the state was the difference between the two. The prosecution timeline was not withstanding the test of time, and all the emotional appeal was rocking like compensatory evidence. The jurors did not want to have more sympathy. They wanted more assurance, and the state had not provided it. The former confidence of the prosecution, which had stood so high, sank on its own side, and left but one question resounding the courtroom: whether they really possessed the truth, or whether they were not overloaded with feelings rather than facts. The verdict: 2 hours to live. The jury debated for 2 hours, a drop in courtroom time, after weeks of speculation, media stimulation, and testimony on the case. Upon coming back, the ruling was obvious and unanimous: not guilty. It was the very state that had taken months to bring together an indictment, which it took a fraction of an afternoon to take apart. The jurors later on indicated that the case did not make sense. The story presented by the prosecution was full of unsolved mysteries: the lost VHS tape, the lost police reports, the unsolved forensics mysteries. No smoking gun, no indisputed DNA connection, and no direct evidence of a connection between Christopher and the death of Melissa. The emotional aspect of the case could not suffice to bridge the logical loopholes. It was a fatal blow to the state, a justification of the principle according to which suspicion is not confounded with proof to the defense. The judge praised his jury for its hard work, but the opinion that succeeded the sentence was more than words could convey. The family was grieving not only on behalf of having lost a daughter, but of having failed to have the justice system deliver justice. At the same time, the man, Christopher, left the court a free man, not because he was acquitted, but because the state could not suggest him guilty. It was a judgment which created itself. Unless there is evidence, emotion is nothing. Unless there is a record, memory is oblivious. And unless there is surety, justice cannot exist. The great lesson: why evidence counts. In its essence, this case is not simply a sad episode. It is a law school lesson of legal responsibility. The whole basis of justice starts to crumble when prosecutors misuse discovery, when evidence is lost, or when important documents disappear. The case of Wolfenbarger commands us that time may corrupt more than it may preserve. Time may corrupt integrity. The state issued an indictment decades old, made by headlines, but starved of sound evidence. They failed to consider the only principle that constitutes fair prosecution, that of transparency, in their haste to provide closure. According to the law of Georgia, all possible evidence, beneficial or not, should be disclosed to the defense. That didn't happen here. The lost VHS tape, the missing reports, and the inexplicable chain of custody all made the courtroom a cautionary tale. Mishandling of evidence does not simply ruin one particular case, but it throws doubt over the whole system. A jury can make its decisions on what is presented and not what is imagined. Ultimately, the not guilty verdict was not a triumph of Christopher, but of sloppy justice. The true moral? Facts are sacred. When once they are lost, perverted, or concealed, even the most just cause is ruined in anarchy, and the truth, however sullen, is buried. What ought to have been a successful case became a lesson. The skull in the bag, the tape which had disappeared, the lost reports of the investigator, all this was more than backstory. It was the unraveling. To the family of Melissa, to the society that had waited 26 years in search of the answers, the verdict did not take away the pain. It only left them wondering the way to the truth. And to the justice system, it made one thing clear: that a case that was based on conjecture, holes, and laces missing is not only weak but unacceptable. After all, the case of the state was not ruined through a brilliant defense, but rather through the inability to prepare. Shivering thought. In the real world of crime, the best plans are made to backfire, not due to the misfortune of evidence being erroneous, but due to the misfortune of evidence being non-existent.